Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Bloomburrow Commander spoilers. So we're on to Precon deck number 2, which is the Jeskai Family Matters deck, and this deck has some of my favorite cards that we've seen from the release so far, which means we should probably jump right into it, start breaking down sweet new Bloomburrow cards. Before we do, a few quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to mtgpreviews.com. And third, if you're looking for the full deck list, I'm going to link it in the description of this video, so make sure to check that out if you want to see the whole deck with the reprints and all that stuff. Anyway, let's talk Bloomburrow Commander. So this is the Jeskai deck, led by Zinnia Valley's voice, called Family Matters. And the idea of this deck is it's all about one-powered creatures and also tokens and offspring. So if you read Zinnia itself, and we're not going to go super in-depth on this one since we talked about this card a few days ago, it was spoiled a while ago, it's a 3-mana 1/3 bird bard with flying. It gets +X/+0, where X is the number of other creatures you control with base power of 1, and then creature spells you cast have offspring of 2, so you can pay 2 mana and you get a 1/1 token copy of the creature, which is pretty sweet with like Muldrifters. You cast a Muldrifter, pay 2, you get a 1/1 Muldrifter, and I really like Zinnia as a commander because you can go in multiple directions with this card. It could be like a value-y offspring Muldrifter deck where you're just trying to do like Panharmonicon value stuff. You could make it a Voltron deck where you're trying to make a bunch of 1/1 tokens and one-shot people with Zinnia, and it kind of ties together because the offspring creatures have base power of 1, it supports Zinnia's first ability. So I really like this card, and it kind of shows off what this deck is about. We're going to see a lot of creatures with base power of 1 and some interesting token shenanigans. So backing up Zinnia, we have Arthur Marigold Knight. Arthur, very powerful card, although I don't really know what it has to do with Zinnia. It doesn't really do anything with offspring or with 1-power creatures. So Arthur is a 5-mana Jeskai 4/5 legendary mouse knight with haste. It says when it and at least one other creature attack, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Return the creature to its owner's hand at the end of combat. So Arthur, very powerful card, especially having haste. That means if you have any one creature on the battlefield that can attack, you can play Arthur from your command zone, swing, immediately trigger its ability, which kind of makes it like a fixed Winota, a Winota that only is going to trigger once each turn, which is good because Winota's a little too busted. Has the upside that it doesn't care about creature types at all. Also kind of compares to like Ilharg, except it's an Ilharg that puts the creature into play from the top of your deck rather than from your hand. And one of the big upsides, I think, of Arthur compared to these other cards is being in blue gives you a lot more free ways to protect Arthur. You get like Fierce Guardianship and Force of Will, which is something you don't get with Ilharg or Winota for that matter. So what do you actually do with Arthur? And the first thing that's worth pointing out is how this card actually works. So when you attack with Arthur and another creature, you get to put a creature into play from the top 6 cards of your deck tapped and attacking. So what this means is it doesn't actually work with things that have attack triggers like Ulamog, Eldrazi that have Annihilator, triggers when the creature attacks, or Drakuseth, when it attacks, deals a bunch of damage to things. These cards don't actually work with Arthur because it's going to put the creature in a play already tapped and attacking, which means you never declared it as an attacker, which is when these abilities like Annihilator, Drakuseth's ability trigger, which I think is actually a good thing. If this was just like, put an Eldrazi into play and annihilate you, it'd actually be a pretty oppressive and like boring to play against commander. Instead, what you're really looking for with Arthur is 2 things. You want creatures that have combat damage triggers, like Ancient Copper Dragon, Ancient Silver Dragon. You can put them into play with Arthur. They're already essentially having haste since it comes into play tapped and attacking. Hit your opponent, roll a d20, draw a bunch of cards, make a bunch of treasures. The other way that you could go is ETB triggers. If you play a bunch of ETB triggers, you can turn the last part of Arthur, which is the creature that you put into play bounces back to your hand at the end of combat, into an upside. You can like put a Muldrifter into play, draw a couple cards, maybe chip in for a couple damage, and then at the end of combat, you pick up the Muldrifter, you can play it again, get its ETB trigger again. So it is some sweet value engine stuff that you can do with this card. The other direction to go is try to take a lot of combat. So we talked about how it's kind of fixed Winota because it only triggers once each turn. Well, there is a way around that, and the way around that is to take more combat steps. If you can attack more than once in a turn with Arthur, you're going to be able to trigger its ability more than once each turn. So imagine like Arthur finding something like Port Razor. When it deals combat damage to a player, untap all your creatures, you get an extra combat phase, can't keep attacking the same person again. Or like Morag, you put a Morag into play, post combat, make a land drop, get another combat phase, get another Arthur trigger. So I think that might be the most popular way to build it, is try to take a bunch of combats and just try to snowball into this huge turn with a bunch of extra combat steps. So Arthur, kind of out of theme, I think, with the rest of the deck. I'm not really seeing the connection to the face commander or the other themes of the deck, but I do think the Mouse Knight is a very powerful commander if you like cheating things into play. We also got a weird new sweeper in Calamity of Cinders. So Calamity of Cinders, 7 mana sorcery, but it has Convoke, so you can tap creatures to pay for its cost, getting all the way down to 0 if you got enough creatures, and then it deals 6 damage to each untapped creature. And I gotta say, I really love the design of this card. So this is like a bad Wrath. 6 damage isn't necessarily going to kill everything, plus it's not going to hit your opponent's tap creatures. But the trick here is, if you're some sort of go wide deck, you can tap your creatures to Convoke, and those creatures won't take damage, so you can kind of turn this into like a weird Plague Wind almost, like a very inconsistent Plague Wind, because it only deals 6 damage, and your opponent might have tap stuff, but still you can kind of turn it into a one-sided Wrath. So this is essentially an Inferno that doesn't hit face, and you can Convoke it out. Also reminds me a little bit of Delayed Blast Fireball, is this card that isn't really a true sweeper, because it's not going to necessarily be able to get rid of everything, because it deals a set amount of damage, but still can be very, very good in the right scenario. So what do you do with Calamity of Cinders? You essentially play it in go wide token decks. I think that's the best home. If you're playing like Jetmir or Krenko or Caesar, then you just take and make a bunch of things, your opponent gets some stuff on the battlefield, you tap your stuff so it's tapped down and doesn't take damage, hopefully wipe out your opponent's board. The other place this works really well is with vehicles. So the trick of vehicles is you can activate their crew ability as many times as you want, even once they're already a creature. So if you have a big board full of creatures in a Smuggler's Copter, you can tap all of your creatures to the Smuggler's Copter to make sure they're not going to take any damage from Calamity, and then cast the Calamity, and hopefully you have a real Plague Wind where you blow up all your opponent's stuff, but none of your board gets hurt. So I think I would play this in actual vehicle decks too, like Edward Kenway or DePaula or Captain Rex Nebula. If vehicles are the theme of my deck, and I'm like kind of going wide with creatures, enough that I'm going to be able to Convoke this a bit, then I think this is a pretty good option. So Calamity of Cinders, not replacing Blasphemous Act or whatever. This isn't the new best Wrath in the format, but in the right deck, a go wide deck that can take advantage of Convoke and tap its own creatures, I think this is actually a pretty solid sweeper option. We also got one of my favorite cards from this deck in Murmuration. It's a 5 mana enchantment that says birds you control get +1/+1 and have vigilance, and at the beginning of your end step, for each spell you cast this turn, create a 1/2 blue bird creature token with flying named Stormcrow. So Murmuration is Crowstorm on an enchantment mixed with Intangible Virtue for birds. So on the turn you play this, there's a few different ways you can play this. So one way to play this is like an actual Crowstorm, where you're going to try to have this storm turn where you cast a ton of spells, then you play Murmuration, go to your end step, make like 20 birds. They're all going to be 2/3s because Murmuration's gonna pump them and they get vigilance. So that's one way you can play this. You can also play this more fairly, where you just play this and maybe I cast 2 or 3 spells in a turn and I make a few birds, and then the next turn I do it again. That's a big upside compared to something like Crowstorm itself, is this is just gonna sit out on the battlefield. In each one of your turns, you're gonna be rewarded for casting spells with a kicker of making a 1/2 bird that's getting buffed by Murmuration. So I think this card has several potential homes. So obvious home number 1, bird decks. If you're playing a bird deck, this card's great because you can really take advantage of the Anthem mode. If you're playing Derevi or Kangi or something, your deck's probably full of birds, and you're not going to maximize the number of Stormcrows that you make, but you'll still make a few as you're casting your spells and giving your team +1/+1 and vigilance, which is huge because you can swing in with all your flyers, get in damage, and still have blockers back on defense. Just that's going to be enough. The other place that you can go with this is actual Spellslinger style decks. So Murmuration's kind of in a weird weird color for Storm. Normally, Storm isn't really a white deck, but if you're playing like Hanada Spellslinger or Kaikar, that's probably the stormiest commander with white in it, or Zephy, this is a really nice option there. In these decks, you're not really going to focus on getting value out of the birds that you have on the battlefield so much, but instead this is like a weird Empty the Warrens or Crow Storm, where you're just going to try to cast as many spells as possible and use Murmuration as a finisher to make a massive board. Also could work in Enchantress. This one I'm a little bit less sure on, but it is an enchantment, and it kind of reminds me of Hallowed Haunting or Sigil of Empty Throne, these enchantments that make a creature whenever you cast an enchantment. And Enchantress decks do have these big Storm style turns once you get Sethis going and you're making so much mana and drawing so many cards. The only thing is, I'm not sure that Murmuration in a deck like Sethis, is it actually better than Hallowed Haunting and Sigil? Probably not. Do you want a third copy of those cards? Maybe. It could be a nice backup version. The other place is just token decks. If you're playing like Mondrak tokens or Ozyrtok tokens, I think this is worth it just because your commander is going to be doubling up the birds that you make a bunch of times. I'm very intrigued by the possibility of trying to build like Mono White Storm or Mono White Spellslinger with Murmuration, because one of my favorite things in commanders is when you can make an archetype work in a color that it's not supposed to work in. And Murmuration is one of the only cards I've ever seen that actually makes me think that some sort of Mono White Storm deck could actually be possible. So Murmuration, the card's awesome. I love this card. The flavor's good. It's really powerful. It's got a bunch of different hopes. Probably my favorite card from this deck. We also got a Gate Instigator, and this one's pretty simple. So it's a 2-mana 1/3 red lizard rogue. It has Offspring of 2 mana, so you can pay 2, get a 1/1 copy of it, and it says whenever another creature you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. So a Gate Instigator, it's Impact Tremors on a creature. If you're a deck that wants Impact Tremors because you're like Norn of the Weary or Purphoros or Animpakel or Krenko, and you're just gonna have a ton of creatures entering the battlefield and you're gonna burn your opponent out of the game, then the card's great. So essentially, if you're playing Impact Tremors, you get to play this too, and in some ways, it's better than Impact Tremors because of Offspring, you can get 2 for the price of 1, although the downside, of course, is it does die to creature sweepers, which Impact Tremor doesn't, but still, if you want to Impact Tremors, a Gate Instigator is a pretty good option. Next up, we got Jacked Rabbit. But well done, Wizards, on that punny name. And it is literally a very jacked rabbit. Gonna go in Phil's buff deck, I'm sure. So Jacked Rabbit, it is pretty buff. It's 2 in X, it's a white card, for a 1/2 with Ravenous. Ravenous means when this creature enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, and if it's 5 or more counters, you get to draw a card, and when it attacks, you create a number of 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens equal to Jacked Rabbit's power. So Jacked Rabbit, it's very much like a card we saw in the Warhammer decks a couple years ago in Trevagon, which is same mana cost, except it's a 0/0 with trample, has the same Ravenous, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you make that many green Tyrannid creature tokens. So Jacked Rabbit is essentially that, but I think upgraded for the most part. It has better stats, and it doesn't need to actually hit your opponent to make tokens. It just needs to attack, which kind of makes it like Krenko Tin Street Kingpin, except for 1 less mana. So I think that Jacked Rabbit, obvious home, gonna be in rabbit decks. Rabbits are all about going wide, making a lot of tokens. In that deck, I think Jacked Rabbit is actually pretty strong. So you just dump all your mana into this, you draw a card, thanks to Ravenous, and then hopefully you have a way to like haste it in maybe and smash your opponent and make a bunch of tokens right away, and then you pop off with Balin, or you have a huge board for Phineas, or you go off with Kadria Caller this small. So I think those are the obvious homes. You could also just play it in a generic token deck. In generic tokens, the bar's a lot higher, and my concern with this card, I do like that it replaces itself if you dump enough mana into it, thanks to Ravenous, but my concern with the card is, unless you can haste it in, it doesn't really do anything the turn you play it. You play it, and it's really big, and your opponents are like, oh my god, I guess we gotta kill that, because if we don't, it's gonna make like 20 tokens next turn, and then they kill it, and it doesn't really do anything. So that's kind of my concern, although if you can haste it in, you get around that problem. But maybe in like Thales or Jetmir, these go wide token decks that just want to make as many 1/1s as possible, that's where I think Jacked Rabbit could be a reasonable option. So Jacked Rabbit, super buff, actually a pretty strong card in the right deck. We also got Rapid Augmenter, which is a new Otter Artificer. It is a 3-mana 1/3 Izzet card. It has haste. It says whenever another creature you control with base power of 1 enters, it gains haste until end of turn. Going back to Jacked Rabbit, in the precon itself. That's why you can haste in your Jackrabbit, make all those tokens right away. So there's a lot of synergy there. And then whenever another creature you control enters, if it wasn't cast, put a +1/+1 counter on Rapid Augmenter, and it can't be blocked this turn. So Rapid Augmenter is actually kind of a wild card. If you think about what this is, it is essentially a fervor for 1 base power creature. So if you're playing a bunch of 1 power creatures, this is just going to haste them all up. And then it scales like a Champion of Lambhole whenever a creature enters but wasn't cast. And there's a few ways that could happen. You could like reanimate a creature or whatever, but the most common way this is going to happen is you make a bunch of tokens, and that's what makes this card pretty scary. That last ability doesn't say whenever 1 or more creatures you control enter without being cast. It says whenever another creature, which means let's say you make 10 1/1 tokens with Secure the Waste, or you make 5 tokens with Season of the Burrow, or you somehow storm off with Empty the Warrens. This thing is going to get really big really quickly, because each of those tokens wasn't cast, going to put a counter on it. So it's pretty realistic that you play this and like Secure the Waste X10 or something, you get a 11 power Rapid Augmenter with haste, and all those 1/1s are also going to have haste, and you just kill someone on the spot. So I think that's the upside of the card. The only downside I see of this card is its colors are a little bit weird. So is just like a weird color combination for a token card? There are some Jeskai tokens decks that fit really well. Zinnia itself, obviously, cares about 1 base power creatures. It's perfect for the face commander. And there's like Kythe is good, Kiker, Akeem, maybe Zyrus. So there's a few options in those color combinations. If this was like a mono white card or something, it would be incredibly busted. It would be so strong. But this is one of those cases where the card is really strong, but its color identity does keep it out of some of the decks where it would be most powerful. But still, Rapid Augmenter, it can just deal a lot of damage. So if you're a deck with a lot of 1 power creatures or a lot of tokens, it's at least in the conversation as a big beater. We also got Pollywog Prodigy, and I gotta know what you think about this card, because I think this card, oh man, I'm going back and forth. It might be busted. It might be straight up busted. It's a 2-mana 1/3 Frog Wizard. It has a Valve. So whenever a creature you control enters, if its power or toughness is greater than Pollywog Prodigy's toughness, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then it says, whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, if its mana value is less than Pollywog Prodigy's power, you draw a card. So if you actually read that, that's essentially like the blue Esper Sentinel. Is kind of like a Mystic Remora, assuming your Pollywog Prodigy is big enough. That's the only concern here. It's like an Esper Sentinel, but it's not going to trigger all the time. Also worth pointing out that it says mana value less than its power, not equal to or less than. So if you just play Pollywog Prodigy and it's a 1/3, unless your opponent manages to cast a non-creature spell with mana value of 0, it's not going to draw you any cards. So you need to scale it a few times, either with a Valve or in other ways. But if you can scale this and get its power up to like 3 or 4 or 5, then this card becomes ridiculously powerful, where every non-creature spell your opponent casts, most likely you're going to be drawing a card, which is just a huge amount of card advantage. It is nice that a Valve lets it scale itself. So if you play your Pollywog Prodigy and then Solemn Simulacrum, you get a counter on your Pollywog Prodigy, which makes more of your opponent's non-creature spells trigger it. And then you play your Peregrine Drake and it has higher toughness, and then it scales at the end. So you just like keep chaining things together. So in the right deck, you can grow it pretty quickly just by playing creatures, but it might be even better if you do it another way, as we've seen with Esper Sentinel, which also cares about its power and is even better once it's higher powered. If you can load it up with some equipment or some auras, then it becomes even more effective. So Pollywog Prodigy, this card is either going to be completely unplayable, or it's going to be a literal staple and like one of the best cards from the entire set for Commander. I guess it's going to depend on how easily you can scale it. I will also say, I feel like this might be one of those cards that gets better the higher your power level is, because if you're playing like pretty casual and everyone's casting, 3 mana rocks and 5 mana wraths, it's going to be hard to get Pollywog Prodigy's power high enough to actually trigger and draw cards off those spells. But if you're playing more like CDH level and everyone's playing Mana Crypts and Soul Rings and Mystic Remoras and Dark Rituals and free counter spells, then this gets a lot better, because you're going to have a bunch of people that are casting all these efficient non-creature spells, which means you don't have to get the power of Polywog Prodigy that high to draw a ton of cards. The other thing about this card, and I know there's going to be some pushback on this, because some people are going to be like, oh, it's not going to draw that many cards. It's a 2-drop. It's the same with Esper Sentinel. If you think about Esper Sentinel, if you play it and it draws you 2 cards, it already did its job. If it draws you 3 cards, you just built Ancestral Recall, like one of the strongest cards in the history of the game. So keep that in mind with Polywog Prodigy too. Yes, there's going to be spells that don't trigger it because they're too high mana value, but it's a 2-drop with a reasonable body. You don't need to draw that many cards off of this for it to be really good, and if you do have those games where you draw a ton of cards off of it, that's where it's straight up broken. We also got a new class enchantment in Fortune Teller's Talent. So 1 mana blue class. First level, you can look at the top card of your library at any time, so I guess some information advantage. For 4 mana, as long as you've cast a spell this turn, you may play cards from the top of your library. So it turns into a future sight with a bit of a drawback that you have to cast a spell. And then the last level, for 3 more mana, spells you cast from anywhere other than your hand cost 2 less to cast. So Fortune Teller's Talent, we have a lot of these cards these days. There's a lot of future sight. It's something Wizards has really embraced printing. In just the last few years, all these play off the top of your deck cards. Fortune Teller's Talent, I think, in a generic sense, is probably not the best of them. If you think about it, to get a future sight, you need 5 total mana, 1 to cast it, 4 to level it up, and then there is the drawback that you have to have casted another spell during the turn to play off the top of your deck, which means if you're completely empty-handed, it's not going to turn itself on very easily, so it's a slightly risky future sight, although in reality, in Commander in 2024, you usually get a bunch of cards in your hand. It shouldn't be that hard to cast 1 spell and then play off the top of your deck, but there are going to be times when that's awkward. So I think in general it's worth future sight unless you're a deck that can really take advantage of that last level. That last level is where the card gets exciting. When you cast spells anywhere other than your hand, they cost 2 less to cast, which of course works with its own ability. If you're casting cards off the top of your deck, that's not from your hand, so you're going to kind of be ramping. We talk a lot about mana advantage, card advantage, the 2 big things in Commander, and Fortune Teller's Talent is a card that kind of does both of those things. Playing off the top of your deck gives you card advantage. Once you get it fully leveled up, those cards cost 2 less. Is kind of a weird ramp spell, so I do think it's a powerful effect. So where do you play this card? So number 1 is decks that are built around playing things from anywhere except your hand, and there's not a ton of these commanders, but like Vega the Watcher, Vol, Kellen the Kid, if the gimmick of your deck is playing things from places other than your hand, Fortune Teller's Talent goes way up in value, because not only are you going to get that cost reduction on the cards you're casting off the top of your deck with Talent itself, but you're going to get cost reductions on other things, casting Adventures from Exile or casting things from your graveyard. So I think that's number 1 home for this card. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of different ways to cast cards from anywhere but your hand, like Underworld Breach, gonna let you cast a ton of cards from your graveyard, or flashing something back with Snapcaster, or our new Osteomancer Adept, letting you cast creatures from the graveyard. Fortune Teller's Talent works really well there too, just as like a ramp spell, and I think this is a card that's designed to power up a few specific new commanders. So the first one I thought of is Flubs the Fool, and this isn't a super direct connection, but if you actually read through Flubs, wanting you to have no cards essentially in hand, but also cast a lot of spells, the easiest way to do that is play a bunch of future sight effects. So you have no cards in hand, but you can still cast spells to trigger Flubs. Also really good with Loot. Loot exiles a bunch of things, and then you can cast those things. So the ramp mode of casting things anywhere but your hand, really effective in a Loot deck. Same with Gonti Canny Acquisitor. That's stealing cards from your opponent's deck, going to exile, you're casting them from there, so you're getting the discount. So I feel like Fortune Teller's Talent, outside of just being a fine future sight variant, is going to be really, really good with some of these hype new commanders. Also worth pointing out, and you probably already know this, but goes infinite with Sensei's Divining Top. I know, we broke Sensei's Divining Top, but the combo here is, if you get Sensei's Divining Top, and you can make it free with the last level of Fortune Teller's Talent, you can play the Sensei's Divining Top from the top of your deck for free, then you can tap it to draw whatever is on top of your deck. That card goes to your hand, top goes on the top of your deck, then you can again cast the top for free from the top of your deck, tap it to draw a card. So essentially infinite card draw if you get Fortune Teller's Talent leveled up and a Sensei's Divining Top on the battlefield. So Fortune Teller Talent, Seems like a pretty sweet card. I don't know if I just play it over Future Sight in every deck, but if you're one of those decks that's casting spells from anywhere but your hand, this card is incredibly strong and probably the best Future Sight for those decks. As far as reprints, we did get Elspeth's Sun's Champion coming back as an Imagine Critter as a mouse. I do love Elspeth. I feel like Elspeth doesn't get the respect she deserves in Commander just because its Wrath mode is actually pretty powerful. In 3 1/1s a turn is a lot to slog to. And then value-wise, couple of $10 reprints, Luminous Broodmoth, Helm of the Host, both like $10, $11, $12, $13. And then Curiosity Crafter, Combat Celebrant, those are in the like $5 range. So actually pretty decent reprint value in the deck. So that brings us to the halfway point of our Commander precons. 2 down, 2 more to go in coming hours. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back in a bit with our next Commander precon. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? We can check out our first spoiler video of the day here, or maybe last week's Commander Clash podcast where we talked about the value of basic lands of all things.